Well, welcome back, everybody. Today, we're going to be starting a look at Chapter 9, Expanding Markets and Moving West. So, we're going to be looking in this chapter at Westward Expansion, which, of course, isn't entirely new. But this is the point where I kind of feel like we're getting into the Westward Expansion that is more in line with a lot of the concepts that we probably already have in our heads. Some of them perhaps kind of stereotypical, but many of them with a lot of truth behind them. When we think about the westward expansion, as far as, pioneers moving west in covered wagons and searching for gold and mining and trying to strike it rich through whatever reason, and moving out west for cattle ranching and getting into, not quite yet, but starting to get into that whole image of the West as this sort of sometimes a place of lawlessness, sometimes a place of, opportunity, the whole shootout in the street and the saloon and all that kind of stuff. And some of that really is a little bit later than what we're looking at here. But this is the kind of westward expansion I know a lot of us, when we think about the American West and things that pulled people west and all that kind of stuff, those are probably a lot of the common images that a lot of us have and the common things that a lot of us think of. So that is some of the westward expansion and the kind of expansion that we're looking at here. But in this first section, we're going to be looking at a concept called the market revolution, which is partially happening because of westward expansion. That westward expansion is partially happening because of the market revolution. All of these things are cyclical, and they're all sort of causes and effects of each other. And this is also very similar to and very, very closely related to the industrial revolution that we've looked at in the past. Once again, kind of a cyclical thing, both being a cause of the industrial revolution, but also a result, and probably more a result, of the industrial revolution and industrialization. So we're looking at the economics of this whole situation and seeing how the country's economy was changing in the wake of industrialization, in the wake of westward expansion, how all of those things were creating a very, very different United States in a lot of different ways. We looked at the Great Awakening a while back, and one of the things I mentioned there was one of the causes of the Great Awakening was there were so many changes that were taking place in American society at this time. And so this might also help us to understand what were some of those changes that then may cause some people to even sort of latch onto religion or want to pursue religious revivalism as a way to sort of combat or be a little bit more comfortable with these changes. So the United States is transforming tremendously in the years after the War of 1812. After the War of 1812, the United States' economy is growing at a phenomenal rate with the coming of industrialization, with all of the internal improvements that would be built in the decades following the War of 1812. The United States is really becoming a transcontinental power. It is spreading certainly beyond the Mississippi River, eventually even going to be spreading in the next couple of decades all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And while we're not going to see, railroads and things like that really connecting the country until later part of the 19th century, there is more of a connection, and there's an economic expansion out west, just as much as there is a pattern of settlement expanding out west. We're seeing the Industrial Revolution, as I've already mentioned a couple of times today, the Industrial Revolution taking off in the north. We are seeing urbanization, people moving off of the farms and out of the rural areas to the cities, whereas in the west, it is still remaining agricultural, but that agriculture is growing significantly, whereas in the South, it is also remaining agricultural, but that agriculture there is also growing significantly with the rise of the cotton economy and cotton becoming the biggest export of the United States. And again, with all of this, transportation is increasing, roads and canals and all of those things are making these different regions of the country more interconnected. So, a couple of phenomenons that are taking place in this time that is creating a unique identity of each of these regions, and that is making them more and more both. It's very ironic that at the same time that they are becoming more distant and more separate and more defined by certain characteristics, they are also becoming the regions, the North, the South, the West, all becoming very much dependent on each other as well. So what we're beginning to see as we see this overall transformation, this 18th century economy, the one of the 1700s, that had been based on small farms and local commerce and local business was growing and maturing very much into a large marketplace, that intertwined with world markets very much. It brings changes to many different aspects of life. But one of the things that's taking place is something called specialization. And specialization, just like it might mean today, if you specialize in something, that means that you have like a specific thing that you are doing, a specific thing that you're good at, and that's what you focus on. You don't do all things, you do that thing in which you are best, in which you are going to specialize. So, and what this refers to is these different regions, particularly in relation to agriculture. Regions are farmers are beginning to specialize. They are becoming less self-sufficient, and they are specializing in like one or two crops, growing maybe one or two crops. And that's kind of always been some of the case in the South, but that's also now becoming the case in the West. Is instead of having a bunch of small self-sufficient farms in which they might grow a variety of crops to sustain the people that live on that farm and that live in that general area, they are now consolidating all those agricultural efforts usually into one crop. And in the West, it's usually going to be wheat. And instead of making or growing or whatever all of the other goods that they need, they are buying them from somewhere else. So that's becoming not just the small family farm that was totally self-sufficient, and they grew most of their food and they raised the livestock that they needed and they make most of their own clothes and they build most of their own stuff. Now they are becoming specialized in that. It maybe is becoming a much larger farm. In many cases, that would be true, and focusing on one crop like wheat. And then we buy the other crops that we need to eat, or we buy our meat from somewhere else. We buy our clothing from somewhere else. That kind of stuff. Specialization. And specialization is happening partly because of some of the bigger phenomenon, a bigger event that really, really brings about all these changes to the economy. And that is something called the market revolution. And you're going to notice here that it's kind of similar to the Industrial Revolution, but they are different things. And the Industrial Revolution is a contributing factor as to why the market revolution takes place. So they're not the same thing. It's more that industrialization is happening or leads to the market revolution, as well as the market revolution actually contributing to the growth of industrialization. So once again, these things are actually causes and effects of each other. But the market revolution, as far as what is changing, obviously a revolution implies that something is changing, that there is great change. It is the change in the way in which goods are bought and sold, a change in the way in which people get goods that they use on a day-to-day basis. And the change is that instead of people making most things themselves or growing most things themselves or raising most things themselves, they are purchasing them. People are buying and selling goods rather than procuring them themselves. And this is, evident in our lives today. The fact that most of us are probably wearing clothing that we did not make. We are probably wearing clothing that we bought somewhere. We probably did not grow and make the food that we ate for breakfast this morning. Maybe some of you did, but you probably bought that granola bar, that cereal, that biscuit, or whatever from somebody else. You probably did not get that from animals that you've been growing on your own farm. Some of you may, yes, grow some vegetables or have a few things around that you do procure yourselves, but most of us probably do not rely even halfway on goods that we made ourselves, that we grew ourselves. We get it from somewhere else. That is the market revolution. And it's a result of industrialization, the fact that now people can buy a lot of those products. They can buy clothes that have been mass produced. They can buy furniture that's been mass produced. Transportation is part of this. It's happening because of the internal improvements that we looked at. People can get crops from somewhere else. They can get those goods. And commercialization, the production of goods. Goods are being made, for cash. They're being made to make money on the market, not just for household self-sufficiency. So I'm not just making clothing because that's just what I do with my time. It is to make, make profit. So just like in the South, how crops are being grown for profit, those industrial manufactured goods are being made for profit as well. So all of those things, industrialization, commercialization of a lot of these goods being made for money instead of just the function, as well as the transportation improvements, all allow this market revolution to take place. Now, we should also have an understanding of, because the word's going to come up a lot, We need to have an understanding of the United States' economic system, because this is one of the things that allows this to be possible, and it's one of the things that incentivizes a lot of this to happen, and that is capitalism. We hear this word thrown around so much all the time, in both good and bad ways. We hear this with both negative and positive connotations, and oftentimes don't really have a great grasp of what it means. A lot of Americans could easily say that the United States is a capitalist system, this is a capitalist economy, but might struggle to actually articulate what that actually is. So we're going to do that right now. Capitalism is an economic system characterized by private ownership of business, private ownership of industry, and that the means of production, the things that we use to make stuff, the factors of production, land, natural resources, labor, all of those kind of things, are held privately, and they're, in other words, they're not controlled by the government. Property is not owned necessarily by the government. The decisions about what to make and how much to make and who should make those things, the decisions about production, are not made by the government. It's not centrally planned. Those things are made by private individuals and private companies. And what incentivizes them to make those decisions is profit. What's going to motivate them to make money. And in this case, we can look, of course, at all the bad things that could potentially come from that, the abuses that can come from that, and those sorts of things. But what capitalism also means is that we have a fairly unrestricted environment, because if you're talking about the capitalism implies the government is not completely out of it, but is a good bit out of it. So this is giving individuals the freedom to make decisions that are going to make them money, and it is that desire for profit that incentivizes people to take risks, to make new products, to invent new things, to build railroads, to build factories, all those kind of things. Because in a capitalist system, you don't have government restricting you, and you are promised the profits that will come from that. Capitalist systems typically protect private property, as the United States' government does. But you also have, well, it doesn't mean you have the total absence of government regulation. It does mean that the government's not saying, okay, this factory is going to produce this and you're going to produce that and we're only going to do this. People are able to make those decisions on their own, and that encourages development, it encourages expansion, it leads to modernization, it means new inventions. All of those things can be traced back to a capitalist system. So we kind of looked at this a while ago, or we might have, in which we looked at some documents about the factors leading to industrialization, and some of those spoke to capitalism. The fact that you have a government that doesn't really get involved in business too much, that protects private property, that protects free enterprise, and where there are incentives of making money, and that incentivizes a lot of this economic growth and expansion that is taking place. So let's take a look at some more about that economic expansion, more of the economic revolution that's taking place. Of course, part of this is industry, the use of power-driven machines to do products, the replacement of a lot of manual labor with machine labor. But there are other things that we could talk about here as well that are part of these technological advancements that are bringing about this market revolution, that is making all of this possible, and that's further connecting the country together. So we have a lot of new inventions that are making production easier, that are making production faster, and that are also just changing the way people live. These are not all inventions that are specifically related to industry and production. We have new inventions involving communication. We're seeing the country expand, but in some ways it's getting maybe smaller in a figurative sense, because it's getting easier to communicate and send messages and send information across vast wide spaces. Whereas it used to take months to get a letter or some kind of information to someone several states away, or certainly an ocean away. That is now longer the case with all kinds of new communication inventions like the telegraph, which is what's pictured here just beneath me. These cables are sending messages across a wire, across a table, with what, of course, we know of as Morse code, using the dats and the dashes to mean words and string letters together to make words. So that's a big advancement in communication, revolutionizes things tremendously. We're also seeing things that just change the way people live, and that make some people's standard of living better. With the advent of urbanization, we're seeing the beginnings of sewer systems and sanitation systems to make life better in those cities. We're seeing the invention of things like the sewing machine that is making the production of textile goods, of clothing, of other kinds of fabric and upholstery. That is becoming revolutionized, faster produced, and therefore easier to produce, and therefore less expensive. We're seeing the beginnings of things like indoor plumbing. We're seeing things like gas lighting, coal burning stoves, and that are just making a more comfortable living and better heating, better lighting, and all of that. But we also have the communication with the telegraph and things like that, which, oh yeah, there we go. The telegraph that is invented by Samuel Morse, thus the name Morse code. Again, before it took days or even weeks for news to travel. Think about, for example, the end of the War of 1812 and how they fought that blast battle 2 weeks after the war was over because they couldn't communicate that information. Well, now that information can be sent over a couple of seconds or at least a few minutes. It's very much revolutionizing things the same way that the internet and those kinds of things revolutionized communication and revolutionized our worlds, in the late 90s, early 2000s. It really does just transform everything. And by the end of the 1840s, there are telegraph lines that are connecting most all major cities in the United States, from New York to Pittsburgh, Atlanta, Detroit, Chicago. There is a way to communicate through most major cities of the United States. We're also seeing major developments in transportation. We've talked about those internal improvements. We keep talking about roads and canals and eventually railroads, but let's talk about some of the inventions, some of the technology that was making those things useful, why you wanted so many more canals and why there was such a big push to build more water transportation and things like that. A major, major, major invention in regard to water transportation was the steamboat, which was first invented by Robert Fulton. He invented a steamboat really in the early 19th century. It takes a while for it to really get going, but it takes off relatively quickly. And this makes water transportation so much more efficient because steamboats had an advantage in that they are powered by steam. They're not just relying on the current and they're not just relying on the wind the way that sail vessels, traditional sailing vessels, or even barges were able to do. Steamboats were able to move on their own power. So that means that they're a lot faster. They could go upstream and downstream. And eventually, once the technology gets a little bit better, they're a lot less expensive. The faster, the greater efficiency, of course, greatly stimulates trade. This is the reason for all the canal building in the 1820s and 30s and 40s. It greatly stimulates trade within the United States. This is part of the reason why industrialization is able to take off, and part of the reason why once industrialization does take off, you want more canals to further transport a lot of those products. So the canal building revolution is partly because of the steamboat revolution. And of course, we can't forget railroads. When we think about internal improvements and the transportation, of course, railroads are definitely a part of that. Although they don't get invented, they're not fully invented at all until about the 1830s. And it does take a while for it to really take off, for that technology to be useful enough and inexpensive enough to actually be practical. They were exploding by the 1830s. The first ones were relatively slow. They're one of the very first ones to be invented. They had a demonstration where they raced it against a horse and carriage, and it only barely beat it. So at first they weren't all that great. But once they get it better to where they did move more quickly. They are faster, they are more efficient. And the benefit to railroads over something like water transportation is that you could build railroad tracks pretty much anywhere. Whereas with canal building, it's a lot harder to build canals. It is much more involved. It is much more intricate. It is just a much more difficult task. And you're also far more limited as where you could put canals. You've got to connect existing waterways. And there are a lot of natural occurrences that can make it difficult or even impossible to build a canal. Whereas railroads, you can pretty much put it anywhere. Not to say it's not more difficult in some places than others, but you could do that just about anywhere. And it is also unaffected by the weather as much. Canals, large amounts of rain or no amounts of rain could make it difficult to utilize water transportation. And of course, the weather absolutely affected earth transportation, land transportation. Roads could get washed out, wagons and carriages could get stuck in the mud, those sorts of things. So railroads overcame a lot of those problems. So all of this together, all of these new inventions, communication inventions, transportation inventions, they fuel economic growth by making those what were once distant markets, what were once distant places accessible. It's now not just a pipe dream to say that you could start a factory and be able to get your products all the way out to the West Coast within a reasonable amount of time. That is now actually possible, and that attracts more investment, that sparks optimism, a risk-taking mentality, this idea that you can invest your money and make it rich. And that just encourages more innovation. If they see one person doing it, someone else gets an idea, someone else finds a way to improve upon that idea. So that excitement and that potential profits that could be made just further advances more and more of these new technologies to be developed and advanced and perfected upon. Now, let's take a look at these different regions of the country, because at this point we could really define the United States by three distinctive regions. Of course, the North and the South that we've looked at multiple times and will continue to, but we're also going to look at the West here, because specialization, the fact that the North is starting to specialize in one thing, the South has really always specialized in one thing, and the West is really starting to specialize more in one thing, are creating these very, very distinctive identities, but they are still even more closely linked together than they ever have been. So it's sort of two opposite things happening at the same time. They're becoming more unique, they're becoming more, their own and more different, but they also need each other now more than they ever have. So let's take a look at these different regions and what we mean by that. So if you'll forgive me, these things I'll go over them one at a time, starting with regions becoming interdependent. So interdependent, it looks and sounds like independent, kind of looks like maybe I've misspelled the word independent. I haven't. It is interdependent. Interdependent means different. Their independent regions, north, south, west, are different from each other. They have unique identities. They have their own regionally based economies that differ from each other, but they rely on each other. They're still connected. And that's going to make more sense as we look at these different regions. So interdependent means that they kind of do their own thing, but they are still dependent on what the other regions do too, and they still need each other very, very much. So let's take a look at these three different regions, starting with the South. Now, we, of course, know and have known for a long, long time that the South is overwhelmingly agricultural, has been since the colonial days, and we looked at that a little bit more in Chapter 8. So the South is very, very deeply entrenched in agriculture, mainly cotton. The cotton economy has taken off in the South, certainly by the 1820s. The invention of the cotton gin has completely revolutionized the South, causing the expansion of the South into those cotton belt states like Georgia and Alabama, all the way eventually even into Texas. That has led to the expansion of slavery rather than the decline of slavery as it was once originally thought might happen. And the South, therefore, relies on manufactured goods from elsewhere. There is hardly any industry at all in the South. There is very, very little diversification in the South. It is overwhelmingly the wealth of the South is tied up in the land, and therefore manufactured goods, whether that's clothing or whether that's shoes or whether that's the whatever they use to, carriages, all that kind of stuff, anything else they use has got to come elsewhere. So that's what we mean by interdependent. They look very different. They have their own economy, but they need the manufactured goods from the North and some cases from the West as well. The North, of course, we know is becoming more and more industrialized. There is agriculture there, but they are moving more towards industrialization, urbanization, factory labor. Immigration is taking place more in the North. The roads, the canals, the railroads are being built far more in the North than they are in the South. So that is what is really representing their identity. But they need the South's cotton for the textile mills that they have in the North, and they rely a lot on the wealth that is generated by the South's cotton economy. That is part of that wealth that's coming from the South's cotton economy from all those exports is what is fueling a lot of the industrial development in the North as well. They also rely on a lot of the agricultural products from the West or the Midwest. So let's take a look at them. The West, or actually at this point we may start calling them the Midwest in order to make sure that we're not confusing the West then with the West, or this version of the West versus kind of, I guess, the new West as it's about to be. The Midwest is in, Illinois, Indiana, eventually, Wisconsin, places like that is what we're talking about here, as opposed to like California. That's eventually soon going to be the West, but here we're talking about that sort of that old Northwest territory. And in the Midwest, old Northwest kind of area, agriculture is the main thing that supports their economic life. But it is very different from the South. Agriculture in the West is first different in the kind of crops that they grow. It's not going to be cotton and things like that. It's going to be mainly cereal crops, wheat and grain and corn. Wheat eventually becoming the dominant crop out there in the West, a major, major, major crop that's soon going to be produced. It is also based on free labor. These are areas that had never had slavery, not most of them, not even for one single day. So slavery and plantations and all of that had never been a part of it. Smaller farms, not big plantations. However, as I mentioned, due to specialization, they are becoming larger, and they're going to continue to become larger till by the end of the 19th century. You're really talking about a couple of huge farms that really overtake the whole small family farm idea that we oftentimes think of. So they are becoming larger. They are becoming far more specialized. And the other thing that makes the Midwest different is its reliance on technology. This makes it tremendously different from the South. The South embraces only the old way of doing things, and they reject any kind of modern technology when it comes to anything. But the West does not. So their agriculture is becoming largely mechanized agriculture, which means that a lot of it is being done by machine. So whereas the North embraces technology as a means of increasing industrial production, the West also embraces technology as a means of making agriculture more productive. Some of the examples of that technology that we need to know. John Deere, which I bet is a familiar name to you because of the brand of tractor. And John Deere invented the steel plow. And then, of course, his name is used for all the tractor and the farm equipment. As some of you know, they make all kinds of farm equipment. So that's easy to remember that he has something to do with farming. So he invented the steel plow. The plow, of course, is the device that is used to churn up the soil and get it aerated, get the nutrients mixed up, and make that soil very, very, very fertile. And the steel plow was stronger and better. It cut the time of plowing and cut the time that it took to get your field ready for laying of the crops by about half. So it has a tremendous impact on the West and making that possible, making wheat production possible in the West. And also Cyrus McCormick. Cyrus McCormick invented something called the mechanical reaper. The mechanical reaper, a reaper is a device that is used in harvesting wheat. It separates the wheat, the part of the wheat that's used to grind to make grain and bread and all that kind of stuff. It separates that from the stalk or the shaft. There's a phrase, separating the wheat from the shaft. And that kind of does, or really not even kind of, it really does for wheat production what the cotton gin did for cotton, in that it's separating the part that's usable from the part that's not usable. And here's what's interesting, is that Cyrus McCormick's a mechanical reaper literally does do what the cotton gin did for cotton. Up until the mechanical reaper, wheat production really wasn't all that profitable because it was so labor intensive and it took so long to get the good part from the unusable part out that you really couldn't make a whole lot of money with it. But the mechanical reaper makes that possible. And this is an example of a reaper here. So you see it being pulled by horses. So it's not totally mechanized, but it's a machine here that the farmer goes over his fields with, and then it separates out what they are going to use versus what they're not going to use. So this is what makes wheat production profitable. And so wheat production is going to explode in the West. And keep that in mind, because this is eventually going to lead actually to some problems. One of the first things we'll look at in the beginning of your 11th grade year is farming in the West and how it becomes a double-edged sword, in that Western farmers really become soon a victim of their own success, because they're going to produce so much that eventually that starts driving the prices down way too low, and it's going to lead to overproduction, which you will hear that word a lot later on. So we are seeing, but getting back to the interdependence, the West, because they're becoming so specialized in agriculture, that means that they rely on the North for manufactured goods. They also rely on the transportation, so they all are connected to each other in some kind of a way and very much need each other. So we are seeing the way people live just change completely. People have access to more manufactured goods. People have access to things that make themselves perhaps more comfortable, but they are also becoming very, very different from each other. And that can lead to some problems as well, as they will not, because they are so different, they will not always agree about where the direction the country needs to go or what is best for everyone.